I'm concerned a little bit about these notions. I've heard you and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talk about the economic populism. I know that was a part of her pitch in terms of that leadership fight. But on the right, their vision is basically populism reinforcing existing hierarchies, and for powerful people, it's a racialized vision. And the contrast with the Democrats, I just don't think has been there. And within the context of immigration, we just left a complete vacuum for them to dominate the discourse there. But when I hear you or AOC say economic populism being the future for the Democrats versus, I don't know, Chris Murphy or other members of the party, what does that actually look like? Because it can't just be throwing immigrants under the bus and stopping using pronouns at different, campaign events. It's got to be centered around a concrete vision of, a Green New Deal, immigration reform and a positive vision, Medicare for all, student debt forgiveness, that kind of thing. Like, is there a concrete discussion being had right now within the party about what that economic populist vision, which is very buzzy right now, like what that really looks like going forward?
Yes, I think there is that discussion, but it needs a lot more conversation. I'll use my state as an example. Washington State was the only state that did not move to the right in this last election. And I'll tell you why. We were the first ones to tie minimum wage to inflation, right? Going back several decades. So our wages stayed higher. Now, on top of that, Seattle was the first major city in the country to pass a $15 minimum wage. The state went forward then and raised the minimum wage. So the minimum wage in Washington State is high compared to other states. And yet we have still done well. We are still a good place for business. All of the, naysaying about raising the minimum wage didn't come to pass. But on top of that, we provided paid leave for people through a ballot initiative. We actually extended gun safety legislation. We instituted a change so that seniors can get at-home care, long-term care. We just passed not universal childcare, but we have a much more expansive definition of childcare with a vision of universal childcare. And so what's happening is average working people and poor people, while they're still struggling, I'm not saying they're not struggling, they are, while they're still struggling, they have much more sense that Democrats have stood up for them and delivered for them. And so when it came to trying to divide people in Washington State on these divisive issues like immigration or trans kids, people said, nah, you know what? Actually, I think they're working for me. We've taken on corporations. Our former AG, who's now our governor, has taken on corporate concentration and monopoly power. And so I think all of these things are part of what the vision looks like, of what it means to fight. And I do think that corporate concentration, corporate power, the elites owning the party is, those are the things that we are going to have to be very vocal about fighting back against, and really having a strategy for every member and every candidate who's running as a Democrat to be very clear about where they stand and who they stand with and what the vision is that we're going to deliver.
You mentioned, and it's a little tangential, but you said that Washington State was one of the states that, or maybe the only state that didn't move to the right. I mean, is that the way that you perceive what happened in this past election, that there was a move to the right? Or was there a
Well, I should have probably
failure?
said Trump to be accurate, because I do think that, and as a previous chair of the Progressive Caucus, we worked a lot with the Freedom Caucus on a number of things, including antitrust, including FISA reform and privacy concerns. There were a number of places where we actually, had strong collaborations. But also, if you look at states that voted for Donald Trump, they also voted, this is to Emma's point about economic populism, they also voted for raising the minimum wage. They voted for paid leave. And so when I think about left and right, it's probably not the best description, and I'll think about it, but they've voted for people they voted for Trump. But I don't believe that the reasons that they voted for Trump are actually going to come into play. And I think people were less likely to be taken by the anti-immigrant, anti-trans stuff if economically they felt like Democrats were taking care of them. And so we continue to be in Washington state, one of the best states for immigrant rights. We have been really on the forefront of protecting immigrants, protecting trans LGBTQ communities across the board. So nothing's being sacrificed there, but we're not allowing people to divide us on those issues because we're also answering economic needs.
Well, I guess what I was asking, I mean, I'm fair enough in terms of how we sort of perceive what people actually voted for. But as far as I can tell from the data, this was an election less of people who did, I guess, statistically speaking, the people who voted for Trump in 2016, or I should say 2020, he got the same share of the vote as he did in 2020. What happened was, at least from what it looks like on the data, and as many people went from Biden to Trump as Trump to Harris, but there was a significant percentage of people who voted, who should have been voting in this election, that didn't.
Correct.
On the Democratic side, as opposed to on the Republican side. I mean, is that the broader understanding? I mean, what is the understanding of what happened amongst your Democratic colleagues as to what happened here?
I think there are several threads. And so what you said is something I've been saying for a long time, that we should think about who the real swing voter is. When somebody says swing voter, some pundit on television or some, big consultant, they usually mean the independent or conservative Democrat or independent voter, usually white, usually in suburban or rural parts of the country. Those voters are important. I'm not saying ignore them, but what I think we should do is think about the biggest base of swing voters as being our base that would naturally be a Democratic base if we put effort into and respect towards actually earning their votes. And that is young people. That's a lot of folks of color who feel like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have left them behind, forgotten them, that the whole system is rigged against them, and that they just want now, at this point, they're so frustrated that they're either going to stay home or they're going to vote for a candidate that they think is at least willing to upend the current system as it is. And so that's, in my view, that's a big part of why we lost a lot of votes, because we had a 7-state strategy that did not target every state across the country, only 7 states. We did not try to cater to and listen to and respect our biggest base of swing voters that would naturally be a Democratic base. And I think over decades, we have alienated the working class, going back to NAFTA, going back to a whole set of economic policies that we either embraced or didn't embrace. Thinking minimum wage here, raising the minimum wage when we had the trifecta, things like that made people question our loyalties, along with taking money from big corporations and big wealthy donors. So I think all of those things are part of what happened, and it's going to take a little bit of time to separate them out and to see what we are willing to do and stand up for as a Democratic Party.
And you mentioned there young people and voters of color. Now, when I first started getting excited about politics was the Obama campaign in 2008. And really, it was his stance on the Iraq War. I did not like that Hillary Clinton had voted for the Iraq War and that Obama was in opposition to it. And when I look at this election, I really wonder if that group of people, young people and voters of color who have experienced maybe American imperialism or like the boot of the state, seeing every day on their feeds, like a child whose brain is falling out of their skull as his father holds him up in Gaza. And Amnesty International now is calling it a genocide. Just that idea of like the economy's not working for me, and this is where our tax dollars are going. Yeah. Is the party reckoning with how this support for this slaughter has potentially damaged the party's brand long term for an entire generation of young people and also the voters you describe?
My honest answer to you is I don't think that conversation is happening. I really don't. I think it's been frustrating to me as somebody who shares, and has been really vocal on Gaza, and been targeted for it by some of the big moneyed interests on this issue, many of whom are Republican mega donors, by the way. I think that I agree with you that this was not, by the way, this was not just young people. It was not just folks who are Arab or Muslim, or Middle Eastern even. It was Black folks. I mean, I think that we saw I was in a lot of communities with Black people talking to leaders of the Black community who were really pushing on this as well. And I do think that there was a real disillusionment with our foreign policy, and specifically on the war in the Middle East. I mean, I think that maybe there was some drop off early on with some other things, but I think that this issue alone, certainly, if you look at key states like Michigan and even Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, there were significant drop-offs and I know because I went door to door on this issue specifically, trying to see if there was a way to bring voters in while recognizing the despair that I felt as well. And so I don't feel like this is one area where I do not yet feel like we are having a real conversation about the consequences, the moral consequences, the consequences to U.S. leadership in the world, much less the political ramifications of what the United States has done or not done.
And since we're talking about foreign policy, and I know you just only have a couple more minutes left, and I do want to get to sort of like the Progressive Caucus, but what's your quick reaction to Biden naming this naval ship after George Bush? I entered in this space as a function, as a fully formed adult, being older, maybe the oldest person on this call, because of the Iraq War. And, I spent a lot of time talking to the late John Conyers about George Bush and the impeachment and the reformation of George Bush. It just seems to me to be shocking that we see this. And, 4 years ago, there was a movement to tear down Confederate statues because they provided a misinterpretation of history, or a specific interpretation of history that, of the lost cause. And we took those down because it is because of the values that it is propagating. What's your reaction to Biden?
Yeah, I also came into kind of my activism with the Iraq War. I mean, I led what was the largest demonstration in Seattle history around the Iraq War. I wasn't a member of Congress at the time, and then I sued George Bush for the deportation of Muslims, Somali Americans, and won. It was a class action lawsuit. We protected over 4,000 Somalis across the country, prevented the Bush administration from deporting them. So I share your concerns, and I think that what is happening is that this is what Trump does. He throws out something so extreme. He is so extreme that all of a sudden, people that came before him, Dick Cheney, George Bush, they all suddenly seem to be reasonable. And I think we have to be very careful about this. And I think we have to be clear that while those people may not be as extreme as Trump, this is not a scale we should be using on any level to assess both the damage that's been done historically, to cover up the damage that's been done historically, or as sort of our guide for what we want in the future.
All right. Lastly, the Progressive Caucus. I know obviously you don't have the same position, but where do you think the Progressive Caucus should go as a caucus to exert more influence? One of the things that has been bandied about is like actually having a litmus test as to who gets that imprimatur. It would obviously shrink the caucus, but it might make it more
potent,
however what's your sense of that?
Well, when I came in, as you know, I've been chair for 4 years, sole chair, and then I was co-chair with Mark Bocam for 2 years before that. And I put in place term limits because I actually believe that leadership should change of these caucuses. So I took myself out of the running. Yeah, which is an unusual thing for politicians. From
your mouth to some other people's ears, but go ahead.
I think we should do it as a party. I mean, I really do. But that was the thing I noticed, is that there really wasn't a cohesive utilization of the leveraging of power, the leveraging of votes. And so we passed several years ago a rules reforms package that required members to, in order to be a Progressive Caucus member, you had to be a co-sponsor on 70% of what we call our flagship bills. That's like Medicare for All, Green New Deal, et cetera. With some, again, in all of these things, we have people who are in really tough frontline districts, and that doesn't always work. So we give them a little bit of an out. But essentially, we're like, you got to be with us on the majority of issues. And then we also put in place other requirements for people to attend meetings, because that's where we actually push back on the lobbyists that are at our door. And there used to be like 10 people at a meeting. So you could have experts come in and explain a bill that was before us on privatization of Medicare, for example, through Medicare Advantage. But if no one's there, then they all go sign the industry letter after that. So really big things. But the biggest was probably this: if the Progressive Caucus takes a position on a bill, that we expect members to vote with us 2/3 of the time. And so that was the beginning. It's why on Build Back Better, we were able to hold not just 3 or 4 members, but 60 plus members who were ready to vote no on the infrastructure bill, which is why it never came to the floor, which is the only reason we got Build Back Better. Because please don't forget that the Senate sent us the infrastructure bill with every single Senate Democrat voting for the infrastructure bill. And then we started getting all this pressure from people saying, don't pass the infrastructure bill. But that took away a whole ton of leverage already when the Senate just unanimously, all Democrats voted for that thing. And it was left to us. There was no legislation called Build Back Better. There wasn't even language on the table for it. And so we had to say, no, we're going to stick together. But I wanted it to be 2/3 of the caucus, not just 5 or 6 people, because we also needed to win the public narrative on why we were doing this and why childcare and housing were so important. And of course, we never would have gotten the Inflation Reduction Act had we not done that. That was lifted directly from Build Back Better. So I think that there's more to do in terms of leverage. And I think that this gave us a really good kind of beginning for how we do this. But a lot of this is about how you go member to member, how you build the desire, the ability, and the courage to stand up in these difficult moments when the speaker is calling you, when the president is calling you, when everybody and their brother are calling you to get your vote. And you have to explain why you're going to hold and fight for something better. I don't think that the American people expect us to win every fight, but I do think that they want to see us fighting for them and not for the wealthiest, and not giving in for the lowest common denominator too quickly. We should fight for the things that we want and put up a really good fight. And at the end of the day, we may not win every fight, but at least we've identified, and the country was with us, and 99% of the Democratic Party was with us, but 2 senators who, are no longer there, blocked the whole thing.
Yep.
Well, Representative Pramila Jayapal, Washington 7th District, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Been interesting.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.